I'm an art person. I love to dance. I love to do art, and hopefully in the future I hope to do art. And so today I want to talk about the role of art, especially in ancient China, like from the Shang dynasty all the way to POD, which stands for Period of Disunity. In the Shang dynasty, starting from the 1600 to 1050 BCE, music played a very big part in the Shang dynasty. It was a ton of progress, and their instruments were so delicate that they were made out of bronzes. Another thing made out of bronzes were pottery. Pottery was made use for ritual arts, and from the Shang dynasty to Zhou dynasty to the warring states in the Zhou dynasty, it was still continued. Jade was another thing that was made in used to made in pottery. Um, Writings, however, in the Shang dynasty were the oracle bones, where they had King Wu Ding, who his name was written all over these oracle bones, and there was a bunch of evidence about him. And these oracle bones are also called turtle shell and cattle shin bone. And that was just what music, pottery, and writings were going on in the Shang dynasty. Now, if we go on to the Zhou dynasty in 1650 to 220 BCE, first there's two periods. There's the West Zhou and the East Zhou. And I'll be covering over the Eastern Zhou during the Warring States period, which I've said before. Ritual art was it continued from the Shang dynasty to the end of the Warring States period, which lasted from 500 to 220 BCE. The Warring States period was what a metaphor we would say the first lotus blossom. It was showing that a great dynasty with so much flourished things comes out of the very murky nature of a lotus blossom. You know how a lotus blossom comes out of like murky water, and so that's what it means. And it's kind of like saying that in these times, Renaissance times were brought up through hardship and corruption. Besides from the lotus blossom metaphor and the ritual bronzes I mentioned before, the daily use of objects like lamps, closets, tables, screens were serious works of arts, and that is considered as art because of the fact that you need to be some kind of artist to be able to create those things. And going back onto the ritual bronzes during the Warring States period, they were the dominant form of art. Now going on to the Qin dynasty. The Qin dynasty lasted from 220 BC to 200 BCE, and there they had the sculpture art, which we know as the terracotta warriors. And within that tomb, besides the terracotta warriors, there was chariots, generals, and jesters. Each one of these terracotta warriors and each one of these sculptures were so different from one another. The artist made them so unique and so different that there was no resemblance between each warrior, which I found really cool. Another thing was architecture. If you think about architecture, there's the king Qin Shi Huangdi, who is a cruel king. He was the one who created the Great Wall of China. He was so cruel, as I say, is because it was more like the people of China, because during the process of building the wall, people died, and regardless if they died or not, they were just literally built into the wall, and people just continue building the wall and adding people into it because people die there, and that's what they did. And so that's the Qin dynasty in the form of art. Going on to the Han dynasty in 200 BCE to 220 BC, music flourished there, and there was a lot of the flute was very important. There were new instruments introduced. There is the konghu, which is the Chinese harp. There's the pipa, which is the Chinese lute, yuan ho, which is a set of 10 small tune gongs, and there's another one that was mentioned was gu qing, which is a 7-string zither, and these were the instruments that made up the Chinese folktales instruments. Other than music, there were the paintings that flourished as well. What happened in these paintings were they're so delicately made and painted that they were so precise and so symbolized that made out the foundations of what came in the future dynasties of art. Now, going to the last but not least, the period of disunity, from the 220 BC to 590 BC. Poetry and calligraphy flowered here. There is a second blossom in the period of disunity. There's poets such as Shi Tao, also known as Yuan Ji. He was a Chinese landscape painter and poet. In the south of during the period of disunity, the South became the center of art and intellectual thought. And in the East, Jin Dynasty, during the Jin Dynasty, Wang Shizi was a Chinese calligrapher, and there was another guy called Gu Kaizi, who was a celebrated painter of ancient China, also a talented poet and calligrapher. He wrote 3 books about painting theories. One of them was on painting. The second one was on introduction of famous paints of Wei and Jin Dynasty. The last but not least, there's the painting Yuntai Mountain. Those are the 3 books he wrote, and he's an amazing painter who's so talented that he's also a poet and a calligrapher. Last but not least, there's another Chinese poet during this time, and that was Tao Yuanming. He was very talented as well. Throughout these few dynasties, the Shang, the Zhou, the Qin, the Han, and the period of disunity, I hope you can see that throughout every dynasty, like whether it was music, different types of music, different types of painting, sculpture, art, drawing, or writing, or calligraphy, like it changes a lot. Just to summarize it up, during the Shang Dynasty, what was most important was really the writings, because the writings were the evidence that gave that Shang Dynasty was actually there. And then in the Zhou Dynasty, it was that the fact that ritual bronzes became so important, and then there was that lotus blossom metaphor, and then the daily uses of objects were another thing that became so important, that was like what the form of art was then. In the Qin Dynasty, you have the very famous Great Wall of China and terracotta warriors, where you went from paintings to sculptures to architecture. And then in the Han Dynasty, you had more instruments. Instruments were more introduced then, and then they were used in new folk instruments. And then last but not least, in the period of disunity, you have a lot of poets, you have a lot of calligraphers, and you have a lot of painters that were so famous that they were celebrated and known for their work, and they had books written and whatnot. And so that's all I have to say about the change of the artists and the role of artists they had during these few dynasties.